It's also interesting that when we tend to try to monitor a little bit the adaptation to this kind of camps, there are some measures that correlate well with the improvement in performance between before and after an acclimation period. And if you look on that slide, for example, these are results from team sport athletes that were tested in Aspeta in Qatar. And you see clearly the different level of correlations. And the highest correlation on the bottom graph on the right shows a clear correlation between the players, the ability to increase their plasma volume in response to the heat acclimation protocol. In this case, it was a heat acclimatization. They were training in Qatar, getting exposed to the heat. So they improved their plasma volume. And this improvement in plasma volume was related into their ability to perform more in another game performed a week after. So the players that had a better improvement in plasma volume were those who performed better during the second game played in a heat after. So again, that could be simple ways to try to monitor the individual adaptation to the acclimation program and have an idea who's been a good responder or who did not respond as well. Measures of body mass as well and sweat rate are often used to assess at the individual level the acclimation to those kind of camp. So when you think about how can we schedule throughout the season heat acclimation, so there will be clearly some strategies to implement these camps at the start of the season, more as a way to boost fitness and use that just as an ergogenic effect as we discussed in the other lecture. And we can imagine if there is a competition upcoming in a heat, to have regularly during the season, as shown in this example for example, a few times during the season, a few sessions in a heat chamber, just kind of a reminder to the body to make him sure he kind of doesn't forget his acclimation and maintain this adaptation through the season to go a bit quicker by the end. So the reacclimatization phase is pretty interesting, and we talk often about what we call the periodic exposure to the heat, which refers to a thermal memory or a thermal plasticity concept. That means that the body, once it has been adapted once, will obviously respond quicker the following time. All right, just not to finish this part, we're going to discuss about other ways to implement these acclimation protocols, because as we discussed in the football setting, for example, it's pretty difficult to have on the top of every single football session, to have on the top another hour, 45 or even more session, could be on the bike, on the rowing or whatsoever. It just becomes difficult to add some exercise to the program of the player. So it's pretty much of a challenge. And even though if we had access to this chamber, because in most clubs those chambers are not accessible yet. So we need to find other options. And I'm not talking about the cost of these chambers and so on, the cost of the exercise. You probably need to have bikes, the normal bikes in the gym, and you probably need to buy another equipment that is specific to the hot chamber as well. So it's a lot of logistics. So there's been slowly new research trying to find other ways to get the acclimation aspects without actually training more, just to avoid to have more load. And there's a few very, very good evidence showing that exposing players to hot water, but pretty hot water, like above 40 degrees, will probably help into getting into the same process of adaptation. And there's just a few studies, but one showing that players who had performed 6 to 7 40-minute hot baths, which is still something, it's not nothing, it's substantial, but now in between 5 or 6 cycling sessions versus the same time just sitting in a hot bath, that might definitely be easier to implement. But with that, over 2 weeks, they got more or less the same adaptation than we've seen normally when players do their cycling sessions in a heat chamber or so on. So that was just a small study that was very, very promising. So that's stuff that I've been implementing on my side without being able to monitor all that, but I really enjoyed, and I think this deserve obviously further research. There's something a little bit more advanced that been used a bit more research on that, is same idea, not adding load, so not adding exercise, but in this time, instead of using hot water, we can use sauna after the session. So it's post-session, post-exercise, post-session sauna. In that case, the few studies have shown pretty good adaptation in terms of heat acclimation by doing still 10 to 12, 30 minutes sauna exposure. Donc sauna, typical sauna, you are above 85 degrees Celsius. But yeah, 10 to 12 sessions over 2 to 3 weeks. And the interest of sauna is that the temperature is so high, is that it increases obviously the internal temperature in the body. Obviously, core and skin temperature rises. Then there's a big increase in sweat rate, and we just start to trigger the process adaptation to heat. I'm not entering into the molecular signaling at this level, but it's a pretty important signaling just caused by the rise in core temperature. The good thing of that is that if players perform the sauna straight after their training session, obviously the temperature is already elevated, so they just have a faster increase in body temperature. And again, after just a couple of days, we can see some adjustments. Like in this example, that's a study I was involved with as well, where there were cyclists, but we can think that the adaptation will be the same for different type of athletes, especially if you look at the bottom right, the top right graph, where you see the changes in plasma volume after a couple of sauna exposure. And you see that after only 4 sauna exposure, so post-training sauna exposure, the average increase in plasma volume was about 12%. So that's pretty interesting. And remember the slide I was showing you before, that like the increase in plasma volume correlated more or less well with the increase in running capacity. That's pretty cool. So that means that just with 4 exposure of sauna, you can maybe increase the ability of players to run at high intensity during games. So that's pretty interesting. Another interesting about this figure as well, if you look at the time course of the plasma, after this 4th day, we got kind of a sharp decrease in plasma, which suggests that there might be a selling point, and at some stage, if you just do too much too often, because of the ability of the body to regulate his plasma volume, to maintain a certain blood pressure level at manageable levels, and through the process of aldosterone and other physiological mechanisms, having too much of an increase in plasma volume is not good for health as well. So in that case, the body might try maybe to avoid to maintain this high plasma volume. So what I'm saying is that it's probably very good for performance, but it might be wise to break a little bit this sauna exposure. So instead of doing 10 in a row, what we've been doing now is just to do 3, 4, get the increase in plasma volume, rest for a day or 2, and start again, just to maintain that and to avoid to go into extreme plasma volume changes that might be actually not detrimental for the health, but that just might be compensated and eliminated by the body. That's a little bit speculating, but that's the main idea. So again, to finalize a little bit this part as well, as we discussed for altitude, there might be an interest to use or to have first a preparatory camp, exactly as we discussed earlier, to check how players respond, how they cope, those who benefit from the acclimation, those who not. This preparatory camp being done 1 or 2 months before the official camp or the competition, and so on. If preparation camps are too much in terms of logistics, it's more the same idea with not camps, but typically acclimation in the club using heat chambers and so on. Okay, and we're gonna finish now by the 4th section of this talk, which is about the guidelines or the different methods that can be used during competition in the heat to improve performance. So in white side, I'd like to say that there is a kind of internal feedback with the amount of the thirst, the fluid loss during matches, the rate at which heat accumulates, and obviously the increase in RP. On the other side, what can help players to fight against this feedback, which obviously tells them to just to stop and not to exercise? Obviously, their motivation, their belief, their prior experience, if they feel better. So it's a lot about feeling better to cope better in heat. There is all this physiological adaptation that we discuss, higher plasma volume, an ability to compensate for to regulate the temperature, but there's a big aspect in terms of feeling well and trying kind of, I would say, to suck into it, to be able just to go through and manage the heat. And in that case, motivation, belief, as I said, experience and cooling are very important for players to feel better and just go harder and go through the heat. So again, when you talk about cooling, it's something pretty easy that can be implemented, and we talk about external and internal cooling. In terms of external cooling, it's pretty easy. Using cold vest, for example, that's been done at some stage. It's a little bit of a heavy materials, but could be vest with ice on it, or simply a cold shirt that has been plunged into the water. Could be cold towels. Could be after the game or after training in the morning, immersion in cold water, of course, using fans that just blew fresh air and so on. Pre-cooling has been used a lot in endurance sports as a way to decrease and to prepare the body before exercising in a very, very relaxed and cool aspect. But obviously, I would not recommend that for football, because obviously cooling the body means cooling the muscles, which is obviously detrimental in terms of muscle performance and probably injury as well. So even though pre-cooling is often recommended, probably not for our purpose. In terms of internal cooling, simple stuff such as ingestions of cold fluids or ice slurry. And there is, for example, a simple bottle that was developed a few years ago by a friend of mine, Paul Lawson, where it's a kind of he called that the flow bottle. It delivers slushies. So like some of the ice cream you might buy at the fun fair with your kids, you can get this kind of, it's a mix of crushed ice that you can just swallow. So it's better digested, and it just helps to cool the body immediately. And that's pretty simple, but very, very efficient as well at cooling the body. Obviously, before, after competition, in terms of hydration, very important to make sure that before the game, players hydrate themselves enough. So generally, guidelines say about 6 millimeters per kilo of body mass every 2 or 3 hours. Obviously, after, make sure you replace the fluids lost. So most of the time, we recommend waiting, measuring body mass before and after the game, and to refill at least 100 or even 150% of the body mass loss to make sure hydration is enough. And obviously, making sure you replace all the electrolytes that have been lost through the sweat. So sodium, sodium obviously most important, and typical recovery drinks with carbohydrates and protein. But the electrolyte aspect is pretty important as well during all the drinks that are drunk before or during the competition. So on that side, I've kind of a summary of all the guidelines, which include not only those we've seen but others. So for example, if you start in the upper right corner, so trying maybe to change as well, if it's about training, to change the timing of the training. So if at some stage it's important to get exposed to the heat to create adaptation, sometimes it might be wiser to have to train very early in the morning or late at night so that you have less heat and you can just train with a better quality that's possible. Make sure you have access to fluids all the time. You can as well change the duration of the practice, more recovery between bouts. Make sure you have every time access to these fans, cooling vests, towels, and so on. And obviously, this will help acutely, but never forgetting that the overall acclimation leading to the game will be probably as much or even way more important than just this acute effect, but probably both needs to be considered at the same time. All right, so now it's time to summarize and wrap up this talk. So that's the last slide. So talking about heat and altitude and how do we cope when we have to play within these specific environments. So we would say that in theory, acclimatization to altitude or heat requires about 2 weeks, with 1 week considered as the minimum time required. If you really want to adapt, that's the minimum time required for sure. When traveling on site early is not possible for different logistic conditions, practitioners may use environmental chambers if available, like as we discussed, a hot room, an hypoxic chamber, or as we discussed as well, could be in terms of heat using a sauna post-exercise, which is probably even easier than anything else. In this context, so if you were to start to use these hypoxic hot chambers, be mindful of the potential increased training stress overall. That means players will have a greater training stress, and this additional load will have to be managed in some way and likely decreasing something else on the side to make sure the load doesn't go like that immediately. In a specific case of a match played at very high altitude, traveling the same day is probably preferable. As we discussed, the flying fly-out strategy, probably way more efficient than spending 2 weeks and getting sick and losing weight and so on and so on. Even though in that case we don't have the option, we don't make the option of getting acclimatized, but fair enough, we just go play and hope for the best. When teams arrive at altitude or the hot environment, they have to be mindful to adjust their training intensity as well to make sure, again, the load is managed properly. And obviously the best way to manage load is to carefully monitor training every day. And even though without big monitoring systems, heart rate, GPS, RPs are probably largely enough to get a good feel of the demands on the players. And finally, during competition, use all the materials that have been discussed and that could help players to cope with the stressful environment. Could be cooling in the heat, maybe oxygen supplementation altitude during halftime, for example, and all the things we just discussed.